I again, in My God is Yahweh by M.B. Veer, the Reformed thinker and preacher, we have the story of the rebuilding of Jericho, the fifth abomination that Veer lists as the things that brought a curse not just on the apostate northern kingdom, the 10 tribes that had deliberately withdrawn from their unity with the 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, but these plans that are now made to rebuild Jericho are in defiance of another thing God had revealed through Joshua, that there would be a curse on anyone who tried to rebuild Jericho. That is, rebuild not the town, because the town was already inhabited, but a curse upon those who tried to turn it back into a fortress, which it had been at the time of the conquest of Canaan by Israel. He goes on, Yahweh's judgment strikes in the life of Hiel, the architect and builder of Jericho. But the judgment immediately raises questions in our minds. Why were all the kings before Ahab, some of whom also took measures to strengthen the kingdom, content to let this fortress city remain a heap of ruins? Why did they tolerate this weak point in their border defenses? Why did the ruins of Jericho remain untouched for more than 5 centuries? Further, what was the significance of the rebuilding of Jericho's walls? In short, what was Hiel's sin? And what was so foolish about Ahab's policy? These questions can only be answered if we first know what message Jericho's fallen walls proclaimed. What was the song of the ruins that the devastated fortress had sung for centuries? In other words, why did Joshua pronounce a curse on anyone who might dare to rebuild this fortress? Why did the Lord want Jericho to remain an open city? The answer is that it was the Lord's will that the voice of his wonders should be heard in Jericho. This city had once been the scene of Yahweh's great deeds. He himself had pulled down the city walls. The victory could not be credited to Israel's strength and weapons, but only to his wondrous intervention from above. The ruins of the once mighty wall testified to the great power of God and spoke to all who passed by of Israel's God and his unlimited strength. So, in other words, Jericho and its ruins become a monument to the word of the Lord. The Lord claimed certain rights in connection with these ruins. He demanded the full right of ownership. Jericho and all the possessions of its people would belong to him alone. Although he later allowed Jericho to be inhabited, Yahweh continued to demand the city walls for himself, for his service and word, hence the curse pronounced by Joshua. Were these not the city walls with which the Lord's own hand had played? The city walls he had torn down so dramatically. Other walls and cities destroyed during Israel's conquest of Canaan could be rebuilt, but these walls remained the special property of the Lord, dedicated to the service decreed for them by Israel's God. Anyone who dared to seize this heap of rubble would be violating the rights of the Lord, for he had chosen to make Jericho's devastated walls and fortress a showplace testifying to his amazing deeds. Jericho's heap of stones contained a rich message. They spoke of curse and blessing, of judgment and grace, of the punishment of the law, and the wealth of the gospel. They spoke first of judgment and punishment. When God's hand shook the very foundation of these walls, the Canaanites were being punished, for their sins were too numerous and grievous to be tolerated any longer. Jericho's ruins testified to God's definitive radical judgment. They were to tell coming generations of the Lord's holy laughter at man's supposed strength, a strength for which man praises himself to the skies. The ruins informed every passerby that although God is long-suffering and gives the sinner plenty of time, the sinner's days are indeed numbered. The sinner is preserved only for the day of judgment. The weathered ruins of Jericho's fallen walls would have to continue to testify in the midst of God's covenant people about God's righteous judgment. The message they preached was about the punishment of the law and the curse of sin. But there was more to the message of the ruins than a warning. The Lord also intended the ruins to serve as a proclamation of the gospel of grace. No Israelite could pass by Jericho without reading the inscription God had written in its seemingly shapeless piles of stones. This city was received only as a gift of grace through the power of faith. Thus the ruins reminded the Israelites that the city had been given to them by Yahweh's own hand as a gift of grace. It was the Lord who had broken the gates and smashed the walls. Moreover, the people of the Lord could only receive this gift of God through faith, not through military might or the power of weapons or tactical cunning, but only through faith did Jericho's walls collapse. In forbidding the rebuilding of the ruins, the Lord made it known that it was his will that this inscription of grace upon the land of promise not be erased. Jericho, after all, was the gateway to Canaan. The desolate heap of ruins represented an inscription that applied not just to Jericho, but to the entire land. Above the land of promise, the finger of God had written that all the promises of the Lord are received only through the power of faith as gifts of grace. This was the gospel message inscribed above the gateway to the land of the Lord. It was not to be erased. Even in times when the covenant people were silent about their God, these stones would testify to his great deeds. We now see why the Lord preferred Jericho's fallen walls to the rebuilt walls of a strengthened city and fortress. The fallen walls were to testify continuously to God's righteousness in punishment, as well as to his generosity. They were to speak of the collapse of any human greatness that sets itself up in opposition to God, as well as of the glory of God's gracious power, which exalts man. Therefore Joshua was commanded to curse anyone who dared to erase this inscription and put an end to the proclamation issuing from these stones. This curse, pronounced by Joshua, bound the judges and later the kings. They all allowed the voice of Yahweh issuing from these ruins free passage in Israel. Although Saul, David, and Solomon did a great deal to strengthen the kingdom, they allowed the voice of Jericho's ruins to speak. The kings who succeeded them often transgressed God's express commandments, but they did not dare disturb Jericho's fallen walls. Ahab represents a turning point in Israel's history, for he changed the policy of his predecessors regarding Jericho. Scripture tells us that Ahab did more than any king before him to provoke the Lord and arouse his anger. This is illustrated in his wickedness in the rebuilding of Jericho's walls. Ahab refused to rule any longer over a kingdom that might tempt enemies to attack because of a border city left undefended. Next, we're going to continue to talk about a king who didn't know the fear of God. I'll put in a link to William Foxwell Albright, the famous archaeologist and Bible scholar, his little book, Yahweh and the Gods of Canaan, when he discusses the difference between the deities of Canaan and the God of Israel. See you next time.